Thank you so much for coming. I hope you're just as excited as we all are to hear about Harriett Root. My name is Caitlin Donaldson. I'm the curator for the Lorain Historical Society. And so thanks again for being here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Hibbard, for today's presentation on Harriett Root. Dave is a former board member of the Lorain Historical Society. He's Harriett Root's great-nephew and last living descendant, as well as the leading expert on this remarkable woman, a woman before her time. So thank you all again, and I will turn it over to David.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming this morning. I know Saturday mornings are maybe not an idyllic time when you want to get up and go hear somebody, but nevertheless you've shown up, so hopefully this will be something that you get a lot out of, and you'll be able to look at Harriett Root in a much different fashion than you may have looked at her before, as opposed to thinking of her as a picture on the wall. I'll try to humanize her for you. Before I get started, I'm going to take about 45 minutes. As a former teacher, and I have 3 ex-students from 50 years ago sitting up front. You can't get away from these people. You just can't.
You can't get away from us.
Yeah. No, I know from being a teacher that the adult attention span is about 45 minutes, so that's what I'll hold you to. I'll take a few questions if you have any. And right now, I'll also call your attention to items that are here on the table, and also some items that are here on this table. All of this deals with Harriett Root. It is either something that is associated with her or affiliated with her, or things that were actually from her estate, which have ended up in my possession. Before starting, just a little about me, and not to bore you, but again, I was her grandnephew. I was raised here in Lorain, graduating from the old Lorain High School in 1963. I'm going to walk around a little bit. I graduated in 1963 from the old Lorain High, earned a bachelor's degree in science, a bachelor of science degree from Ashland in 1968. It's now known as Ashland University, one of the land-grant schools, and most of those in Ohio have morphed into big universities now. Spent 37 years in the workforce in the areas of education, telecommunications, state government and regulation, and lastly but not least, the automobile industry, all in an area of 5 states. 4 of them took me away for about 20 years. My dear wife Elaine is in the back of 51 years. She's tolerated me all this time, supported me all this time. She's also played a big role in getting me started on this project, and then stepping back and saying, Dave, this is one of your family members. The story is best told by you, not me. And then, until yesterday, she said, Dave, you don't have enough material. So this table of materials that you see up here is part of what we were going through last night to add to what is already on this table. But you didn't come here to listen or to hear me. Let's get started and talk about Harriett Root. Harriett Root is generally looked upon as a former Lorainite, but she didn't start out that way. She was born in Elyria on August 27, 1885. That there is Harriett Root at 1 year of age. We think it was about 1886, but we don't know because the photo does not have a date on it. Her father at the time was Orville Root. He was the Lorain County auditor. And at that point, he was nearing the end of having served 3-year terms as the auditor before going back into things like banking and being a commodity merchant. This other photo on the other side is her in front of her mother. Her mother was Sarah Howe, and her mother married Orville in 1878. I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but Harriet spent 4 years or 5 years in Elyria. And in 1889, her grandfather, who was William Henry Root, and who built the Root House that stands at the corner of East Erie Avenue and Root Road, he passed away. So within the year, Orville, his son, Harriet's father, had moved the family into the Root estate here. And it was a working farm at that time with 3 buildings plus the house as you know it now. Well, not quite as you know it now, but the same house. During this period, she went to school in Sheffield because the home at that time was not located in Lorain and would not be located in Lorain until the property or the boundary line of the city was moved out there in 1920. And then by default, Lorain claimed Harriett Root as a Lorainite along with every other person in that household. That's what it used to look like if you drive by it now. It no longer has the porch. There was a major renovation on the house in 1920. A lot of things were done to it. And for some reason, they decided the porch had to go. Now, we know that she followed the life of a country girl and a farm girl. And we also have a situation here where there was a photo, I think, Caitlin, in 1895, the one-room schoolhouse. Can you bring that up?
Oh, I didn't put that in here.
You did not put that in here? Okay.
Sorry.
We had an interesting photo of Harriet, and some of the kids are the roughest looking kids you've ever seen. And I know that from Sheffield because there's 3 modern versions of them right here, right now. Okay. This is another photo of Harriet that was taken about the time that I estimate she was about 10 years old, probably in the mid-1890s. It is probably the one photograph of her that has a little bit of a sexual content to it. It's about as sexy as I'd ever seen her in any of the photos or that I ever knew her. Now, in 1899, while still living in that home, and she would for the rest of her life, she enrolled in Lorain High School. It was the beginnings of the old Lorain High School, and she graduated in 1903. She related to me one day a story that happened in the autumn of 1902. One of the steamers that was coming into Lorain or leaving, I don't remember which one it was, ran aground east of the mouth to the Black River. And they were allowed, they came around to all the classrooms and said, you're allowed to go home. You can go home early, or you can go down and watch the rescue. The Coast Guard that was here in Lorain was calling in reinforcements from Cleveland. And essentially what they did was to shoot a line from the ship, or shoot a line from the shoreline to the ship, which had a little trolley on it for somebody to ride on. And each side of that trolley had a rope. So when they got it out there, one man would get on, the fellows on the shore would pull the trolley in, man would get off, the people on the ship would pull the trolley back out on the line. Everybody got off in short order. Nobody was hurt or no one drowned. So that was one of the things that she recalled at that time. In 1903, when she graduated, she enrolled in Ohio State University, and that's where she started her college career. How many of you are from Ohio State? Are there any of you? Oh, 2. Am I wrong by saying that, or should I be saying the Ohio State University? Doesn't make any difference. Oh, I heard that recently one time. No, Dave, it's the Ohio State University. All right, well, she spent 2 years there. Don't ask me why, but she transferred out to a college in Massachusetts known as Wellesley College. And some of you have probably heard of Wellesley. It exists today. It is an all-women's college, and it has a very famous alumni who ran for president in 2016 in one Hillary Clinton. One of the interesting things was, and I just found this out recently, and I've got to tell you this because I had a really hard time wrapping my head around this. Harriet, and I didn't know the sport went back this far. Harriet was a varsity basketball player for Wellesley. Now, the reason I can't get my head around this is because I knew her in one way. A white-haired senior citizen who always walked around her house in a house dress. I could never get it around me, around my head, that with that image that Harriet's out there shooting baskets, it just didn't seem to fit. But she was nevertheless a varsity basketball player the last 2 years. Her major was literature and her minor was economics. And in 1907, she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Wellesley and came home Lorain to live here. She assumed duties on what was then the working farm. Now, I'm going to divert just a little bit because I've had 2 or 3 people in this society say to me, Dave, I did not know you were related to Harriett Root. Or Dave, I did not know that the Hibbard family and the Root family were tied together. So this is a good opportunity to do that. Forgive me, this will take 2 or 3 minutes. There was another event in 1907 in the Root family that involved Harriet's older sister, who was Frances Elizabeth Root, 5 years older, better known to the family as Fanny. In 1907, she became the head librarian for Lorain in this very building. Okay? This is also going to tell you why I'm here. She had graduated from Wellesley College in New York in 1902 with honors. I heard it said while people were alive in my family, and I saw it in written documentation about her, she was considered to be absolutely brilliant academically. And I always remember her, in the short time I knew her, with a magazine, a book, or a newspaper. Unfortunately for her, I always remember her doing this. And that would eventually take her life many years later. But she won the job here after working in the Cleveland library system for 2 years. She may have graduated from Western Reserve with a master's degree. I know she was there for 3 years, and I believe at the time what she was doing was earning a master's plus certification to be a librarian in the state of Ohio. So when this position opened up here, here she comes. She wins the position here. Now the other half of the equation. Albert Kais Hibbard was born in Fitchville, Ohio. If you know where that's at, that's about 40 miles west of here. Born on a farm. He was a man who always said that if you want to know the year I was born, it's easy to remember because I was born in 1876, which was the year of the American Centennial. He graduated from New London High School in 1895, taught 4 years in the Huron Public Schools, only as a high school graduate, but he was teaching grade school that was like 4th and 5th grade. In 1900, he enrolled in Wellesley College, graduating in 1904. And during that time, he started selling stereopticon equipment. He said it was quite lucrative, and he was probably able to pay for a lot of his college for it. How many of you are aware of a stereopticon viewer? A few hands? Okay. They produced these cards. Some of these were like geometric figures, and oftentimes they produced a double photo. So when you put these in here, you didn't see in 2 dimensions, you saw in 3 dimensions. And this was a very early version of visual media. At the time when they started selling these things, you only had people of wealth who could buy them, or they were well-to-do, but they were often sold to colleges, and usually the college libraries are the ones that bought it. In 1906, Underwood and Underwood, who my grandfather, because he became my grandfather, went to work for, had a new program, and they said, we're going to see if we can up the sales by going to all the public libraries throughout the United States. One morning from his office in Cleveland, Albert Hibbard got on the interurban, came to Lorain, got off, and on a cold call, he came down 10th Street. Albert Hibbard walked into this very building 114 years ago to sell this equipment. Who did he meet? Frances Elizabeth Root. You know where I'm going, don't you? Make a long story short, on September 27th, 1910, those two tied the knot at the front door of the current Root home. Albert Brown was the Congregationalist minister. He officiated. There were approximately 25 people there. So to make a long story short, you now have the connection between the Hibbards and the Roots. And how do I fit into that? Albert and Fanny produced two sons. Robert Root Hibbard, deceased. William Loomis Hibbard, deceased. Robert Root Hibbard became my father. And since Fanny was 2 degrees of separation from me, that made her my great aunt. So if anybody is still in the dark about it, that should clear things up as to how the Roots and the Hibbards came together and how I'm a relative. Sorry about that, but it took a little more time than I wanted. So, we're back to Harriet again. Let's go to 1909. There was a program started in South Lorain for sewing classes. That's a nice shot of Harriet in her earlier years. The sewing classes were for the daughters and wives of immigrants. There was a lot of immigrants coming here to work in the new Johnson Steel plant at that time. So a group of women got together who were already here and said, let's try to organize this program, and Harriet was one of them. So they finally approached Harriet and said, are you interested? And she says, absolutely, I would love to join the organization. I would love to be able to help bring this about. And somebody said, well, gee, that'll be great, Harriet. We can line you up with some other instructors and you can teach sewing. Harriet says, I don't know how to sew. What do you want me to, no, I'm not here for that. And they said, why would you want to be a member of this group and you don't know how to sew when the purpose is to sew? And she says, but I can organize it. I want you to remember that about her. She was a grand organizer the entire time she was alive. That's all she ever did. Organize, organize, organize. So, in fact, that's what happened. She was responsible for the early organization of that. And I believe, as some of you know of Neighborhood House, you know that effort was affiliated with the early years of Neighborhood House. That continued for 2 or 3 years, and Harriet made her mind up. She was still a country girl. She made her mind up she wanted to make her living in farming. Now, the Root estate, as you see it, is simply a large house on a large piece of property these days. But there were 3 barns there at the time. They had cattle, and they raised crops. The size of the farm was 120 acres, and it did prosper. There was money to be made there. And Harriet said, I'm going to run the farm and take it over from my father, Orville. In 1912 or 1913, she took a few months off. It was a 2-month course. Went back down to Ohio State and took an agricultural course. And it probably covered things such as farm management, crop planting, plowing techniques, that type of thing. And so for the next 8 years or so, that's what she did. Now in the off periods of her life then, she did a little bit of social work and began to become involved with the Lorain chapter of the Red Cross. So that's where we put her at about 1918. Keep in mind there's a war that had been going on since 1914. And when that war was getting into its final period, when America had joined the war, her college, Wellesley College, came about and organized a group of women into what was called the Wellesley Unit. And the Wellesley Unit was going to get together, probably about a dozen women, and go to Europe, and they were going to do welfare work over there, working with the troops, working with captured European citizens that were being brought back to their countries. So in March of 1918, Harriet was a member of that group, and if you read some of the articles about it, she was considered a jack of all trades and a master of none. But again, she was an organizer. She could look at chaos, make sense out of it, and put everything together. Their ship sailed, and that was the only way you got to Europe then, so they had an ocean liner. There is a document that we have here in the, there's a big binder, and it was written by one of her colleagues. They got to England, or off the coast of Ireland, and suddenly there was a bunch of little ships came out. And the gal that wrote this account was somewhat cavalier about this, and what she didn't understand was these were destroyers and a cruiser from His Majesty's Navy. They were there to protect the ocean liner because just 3 years before the Lusitania, which we now know was carrying munitions, was sunk in the Irish Sea. So they went around the north coast of Ireland. To make a long story short, they were attacked 3 times, and the British Navy scored 3 victories by sinking 3 German subs. So Harriet's life and those of her colleagues actually was under threat. They docked at Liverpool, took a train to London, and began to organize. Then they went to Southampton, took a boat, where they were in relative safety because the English Channel at that time was loaded with the English naval ships. Made their way to Paris, and then from there, the whole group splintered and went several different directions. Harriet and 2 other people went to Lyon, which is in the eastern part of France. It was outside the war zone. And it was there that she and 2 other colleagues began to work on receiving people who had been captured and enslaved by the Germans. What you don't often hear in the history books is that Germany needed people for its military forces. So they began to run short on things on the civilian side. Guess what? You're overrunning parts of France. There's men, there's women, there's younger people, young men, young girls. Take them to Germany and enslave them. Let them do the domestic work while our military fights. And this became even more of a practice as the war went on because things started to go against Germany. They needed every man they could get. But it also worked against them because as the war began to reach its termination, they couldn't feed these people anymore. Their own people began to starve. So they were sending people back to France and other countries. They were usually half starved. Their health was in decline. And Harriet and these other women were there to make sure that they had medical care, that they found a place to live, that they had food to eat, that they had a possible job, that they had new clothing. They were just plain poverty-ridden by the time they got back from Germany. And this is quite extensive, even though you don't hear about this. Later in the war, before they came home, they then moved over to Bordeaux. Now that's a coastal city. And she and a number of other women kind of came back together. They were working with soldiers that were convalescing. Now there are some things here, and you may want to take a look at these after I'm finished. There's a mess kit here, a first aid kit that she acquired in Bordeaux. There's also, and I have some provenance here, I took a picture of this. This was a letter opener probably put together for her by a soldier. It's not here because, as you can see, the handle of this is an unfired rifle shell. So that's an exploded ordnance. And guess what happens to unexploded ordnance? You don't want to handle it because it can just go off on you. So that's why this part is not here. My wife had my welfare and your welfare in mind. She said, don't bring that to the Historical Society. So it's pictured, okay? All right. So a year later they came home And in 1919, she became the executive secretary of the Lorain chapter of the Red Cross. And she's going to be with the Red Cross for any number of years now, following this. Yes, you're right on cue, Kate. All right. So what she was doing here was general administration. She was also doing claims, and she had a staff to fill out claims for, these were war claims for wounded soldiers and others. And then she also did relief work for the Lorain tornado in 1924. This was the beginning of relief work for her, and a lot of it, and her appearance on the national scene. They began to recognize her in Washington that this is somebody who could enter a chaotic situation and really straighten things out. So between 1924 and 1930, she did relief work, and in no particular order. She worked at least 2 different hurricanes in Florida, one tornado in St. Louis, another tornado known as the Great Tri-State Tornado of 1925. If you know anything about that storm, it devastated 3 states, killed hundreds of people, and unlike tornadoes that sometimes bounce, this thing came down to Missouri and ground its way through, never left the ground until it almost got into Michigan. So she was doing all kinds of work like this, and she really began to gain a reputation nationwide for her talents. She still was based out of Lorain, though. But any of these disasters could take her away for as little as a month, sometimes as much as almost a year. So then that brings us to the time of the Great Depression. As the Depression started, she did a little Depression work in drought relief in the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. All of you remember your American history, you know we were in a great drought during the Depression. There were a lot of crop failures and other things like that. And she came home and actually assumed the responsibility, and I don't know if any of you know this or not, I did not until I was researching her papers. There was a giant commissary set up here in Lorain. It served 2,000 families. Food, clothing, that type of thing. I did not know that. And she did that for approximately 2 years. So one of the things I want to call your attention to, and in that I didn't know this, is that she was doing nothing but misery jobs for about 6 years. That's all she saw. People who had been devastated by floods, tornadoes, and whatnot, the Depression. There was also a dam failure in California, I forgot to mention that. Now, we come to the end of the 1931 year, and she's been doing the commissary here. The Lorain Journal at that time was in a place where they were offering a Citizen of the Year award. They'd been doing it for about 4 years. And there were 5 or 6 people nominated for the award. Harriet was nominated for that award. And in the end, she received it. She got all the votes. In accepting that award, Harriet was quite gracious. She was never somebody that was looking for a lot of glory. And she said in accepting the award, she said, you know, there's so many other people here that could be deserving of this award. She says, I feel I'm not. But I will accept it on the premise that you understand all of the good things that were done, not just by me, but other people. What she won for that was a wind-up Seth Thomas clock. And if any of you are familiar with a thing called the bell curve, particularly teachers, the bell curve, if you're graphing it, starts real narrow and goes to a high hill and then comes back narrowly. It was that shape. It was wound on a regular basis. It chimed Big Ben. It was a great timepiece. I remember it in her home for years and years, chiming out the time. Unfortunately, I didn't get my hands on that clock when her estate was broken up. Now, this was just ahead of a promotion for her that took her to Washington. And she was working with the Red Cross in the field of commodities, and one commodity only, and that was cotton. The Red Cross had a huge program going on that she worked for the assistant of that program, or the head manager. And what she did was they were dealing in the production of cotton, the harvesting of cotton, the refining of cotton, and oftentimes that cotton was then sent out to make clothing, medical supplies, and anything else. It involved a budget of $31 million over a 2-year period, and at the same time involved over 850,000 bales of cotton before she then moved on. That's her place in Washington. Very benign, a lot of people, a lot of desks. This happened until one day she received 2 visitors. And she told the secretary, please show these gentlemen in. And they came and they said to her, they said, we came in here to talk to you about a job opportunity. And they explained to her they wanted her to start, or they were interested in having her start, a U.S. information service if she was interested. She asked him, where did you come from? Who sent you here? The gentleman said, we're here from the White House. The president has sent us. Your name has been brought to the attention of a number of people in Washington as a potential individual to get this job done. Make a long story short, about a month later, she started the U.S. Information Service. And I've got to tell you, she was not a pretentious person. She was goal-oriented. She was pushing forward all the time. She didn't really care if she got credit. Her business card is here. If you look on the business card, it's even smaller than business cards that I used to hold for myself. And it simply says, Harriett Root, U.S. Information Service. And yet she was the organizer. 25 women. They answered just about any question that you could call them with, although the express purpose when they started was to funnel people toward resolution for problems involving government people. 2 things I'll bring up to you. One of them was, I asked her a question one day. I said, Aunt Hat, when you were doing this job, what was it maybe that most angered you about the calls that you received? And I can still remember there was almost a fire that just appeared on her face. And she said, you want to know what it was, Dave? She said, I just despise these calls. She said, I would get them, my people would get them, master's degree candidates and PhD candidates that would call in and say, listen, can I pay you something to do my thesis? And you hear about stuff like that today even. And you know, I would have thought even myself, I would have thought during the Depression, hey, everybody's clean cut. It's not like it is today. No, it was not. The other thing that was of interest is that, and I cannot fully explain this situation to you, but the government started looking for women with blonde hair. And what they were looking for was they needed the blonde hair strands in the manufacture of machinery. I've never understood how that would come into play. But they asked the U.S. Information Service, would you put the word out, we need blondes to send in here. Don't send anything that's less than 22 inches. I said to Aunt Hattie one day, I said, well, that's kind of interesting. I said, I'm not sure what they wanted it for. And she says, I'm not sure either. And I said, well, how did that go? And she says, we had more blonde hair than you could shake a stick at. They kept reporting back to me, we got what we need. Tell these women to stop calling. So in the end, after only a month or 2, they had all the blonde hair they needed. So I thought those were 2 interesting things. And there was a lot of articles put out about her. One of them in Vanity magazine. I don't know if Vanity exists anymore. Family Circle had another. And somebody really wrote out a whole nice list of questions, and that information is here in the big binder. And it was amazing. There was one area where they wouldn't touch. Somebody called or wrote them one day because they took calls, they took letters, they took walk-in. Somebody approached them one day and said, my wife found out about my affair. What would you suggest I do? And their general response was, we don't get into that area. We just don't touch that. So this went on for a number of years. She was very well known in Washington. She knew the Roosevelts, and she was invited to teas at the White House. She knew Eleanor personally. Some of those invites are in the book. We have some of those. And during that time, near the end, when World War II started, the Office of Information was merged into a new area called the Office of War Information. And this came up in 1942 after Pearl Harbor. There are numerous posters that survive because of her. And because of the fact that she was where she was located, she had all kinds of access to a lot of printed information. And I'll call your attention. You need to thank my wife, Elaine. She made me dig all this stuff up last night. Here's some more posters for you to see in person. Otherwise, you're looking at posters up here. There's simply too many of them. If we'd laid them all out on the floor here, the whole floor would be covered. Or that many of them. Now, I don't know if, I think most of you should be acquainted with the 4 freedoms. These were Depression era. I have a full set of those plus almost another set. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom to worship, freedom of speech. And these are things she acquired during the Depression. Now, there are some interesting pieces that were put up by the War Department. This is one of them. And this is typical of some of the things they put out. She has 2 years of these, and then they stopped because she left the country. I'll explain. This is the type of information that was given to military personnel in the field. What would you use that for? Take a look. There's the dress, there's the insignias, there's the type of motor vehicles and tanks they use. And this was a good thing if you captured a German soldier. Because if you knew this and had this in your head, you knew who you'd captured. You'd know how important they were. How much can you question them? How much might they know? That's the Kriegsmarine. That's German again. And a lot of the naval personnel probably would have been familiar with that. Also, these, here's a photo of Franklin and Eleanor with their dog. She picked up some of these while she was in Washington as well. Here's one of her invitations to the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt often hosted a lot of lunches. Now here's an oddball thing. Harriet was a Republican, but she was known to show up by invitation at the Jackson Day dinners. Those are still held today, and if you know about the Jackson Day dinners, they were a Democratic Party function. But back at that time, you didn't necessarily have the political turmoil like you have today. She attended a couple of inaugurations, and then the war started. She's still in Washington now. Here she is releasing a dove. There in Lorain was a thing held in 1942. I'm behind. It was called Blast the Enemy Days. And Admiral King, who I think all of you know about from Lorain history, wrote a note of thanks for Lorain for its support and offering his support to the city in the war effort to defeat the Japanese, which was in its earliest days. There were supposed to be 6 doves released, and the reporting on this is kind of unusual in that they said, well, Harriet was going to release a dove from the White House steps. This photo is proof that she did not. She released it from the OWI steps where she worked. 6 doves, they were all from or pigeons. They were released into Washington. They were from here. They transported them to Washington. Each pigeon had the same message of support for the city. We don't know if any of them made it back. That might be a project for any of you that want to follow through. I don't know. I haven't looked. We do know that she released one. Admiral King released another, and there may have been 4 others released by other individuals. There were 2 concerns. Number one, along the way there could be hawks and eagles that would find their dinner in these birds. Secondly, there was concern whether they could get over the Appalachian Mountains. So I don't know what happened, but they did go through the exercise, and that's what you're seeing here. All right, shortly after, Harriet is sent to Australia. She is relieved of her duty in the U.S. Information Service, and what she did here, she went to Australia to do again. 3 major libraries set up, one of them in Sydney, where she was based. And these would be information centers for Australians, as they were our ally against the Japanese, where people over there could go to get information on the United States. If you wanted to talk to somebody in a certain area of government, this is who you contacted, this was a phone number, this was an address. She did a very good job there. But I happen to note in a newspaper print article of her that the person who seemingly was getting the credit was her boss. But guess who did the legwork? It was Harriet. This is one of those reasons why you say she was ahead of her time. She really was on time. That was her assigned period, 1885, 1975. She was ahead of her time because she was doing work for which she could get credit, but she never did in many instances. Now, she was there for 3 years, and in 1946, the job was done. She was ready to retire. She got on board a ship called the USS Rattler. And it was a cargo ship. By the way, she's with 3 young Australian women in that picture. They're looking at a U.S. map. They were all in love with and going to marry American GIs. So she spent a little time, quality time with them, telling them what to expect when they got here. The bottom picture is her ship on the right and another ship. I can't remember it now. I looked it up. But what happened was they left Australia. They were on their way home, and it wasn't too long before the captain called everybody and said, listen, we've just gotten a distress call. There's a ship that's at Vanuatu. They need help. We're going to go help them. And so they diverted for a week. So Harriet had a beautiful week in Vanuatu because it took a week to repair the other ship with the help of their crew. They were anchored in the cove, and every day they'd get up, take a skiff, and go ashore, walk the beaches, hike in the jungle, do whatever they want to do and totally relax. Eventually, when that was done, they got back through the Panama Canal. She left that ship in Boston, checked out in Washington, and retired and came home. I might add that in 1942, there was a drive here for Red Cross membership, and when the Red Cross achieved its goal of new members, they decided to award her a new membership in the Red Cross because she was no longer a member here. That's what that was. Incidentally, there's some pins. That's only part of the collection. They're up here. I don't know what all of them are for, but they're interesting to look at. So some of you may want to come up here and take a look at these after the effect. And again, I've written provenance so that you can read and find out what they were for. Now, when she came home, I can pretty much summarize the next many years in telling you that she picked up where she left off, except she was retired. She was now a volunteer again. She volunteered for Red Cross. She got heavily involved with fundraising for the Salvation Army. And up here on Broadway, at 25th and Broadway? That building's now about 60 years old. She was on the board and one of the people involved in the fundraising drive for that building. She also was asked to speak at any number of events as a speaker because of her experience in the U.S. Information Bureau, the Red Cross, and in Australia. I would like to read to you a few things that I wrote down. This is a personal memoir of mine. I'm about 9 years old at this time, so what I'm reading to you, of course, is all recall. My summers at this point were spent working part-time for my great aunt, Harriett Root. Although she was my great aunt, I always referred to as Aunt Hattie, as did everyone else. I actually started working for her the summer before as a fourth grader. I worked for her in and around the old Root home, which literally was my second home because it was just across the street from me. She paid me 25 cents an hour and was quite strict as to how she expected me to complete my tasks. By the third summer I'd been working for her, I was beginning to get to the point where I could put in 4 hours without stopping and earning a whole $1. Up to that point, it did require some effort to continue working, as I might easily tire and become quite bored with some of the tasks. Some of the work, outdoor work in the garden, was demanding, and I had to discipline myself to stay at it. I remember how I struggled. Today, the art of concentration seems to be lost in the lives of many young people. At least that's my opinion. After working in the morning, I would usually go hang out with the other kids on the road. There was another thing to humanize her a little bit. If you've ever been inside the Root home, there's a hallway that leads from the front parlor to the dining room. For years, I noticed every time I walked through that door, instead of being a square doorway, it began to look a little bit like a trapezoid. And that door would never close. And I was following her through the house one day. She wanted to show me something. I walked through that door and I thought, well, this is a good time to bring this up. And I said to her, I said, Aunt Hattie, when are you going to get that door fixed? She kept walking for about 5 steps, stopped, turned around, and looked at me and said, Dave, if you were over 100 years old, just like this house is, you'd be crooked too. There was my answer. That door is still crooked, by the way. The summer of 1959 found me working for Aunt Hattie as I had for several summers. At that point, I was still working for about 25 cents an hour. I was losing my spending power to inflation and didn't even understand what inflation was. Bob Kalis, who lived a short distance up Road Road from me, was also working for Aunt Hat and made the same wages as I. Bob was one of only a handful of us. Bill Murray, who's sitting directly back there, was another very good friend. Bill, I'm glad you're in my life. Thank you very much. He and I have known each other since 1950. I'm not sure why Bill was here, or Bob was here and Bill was not. But this project here was a sidewalk project. The grass had overgrown the stones, and to make a long story short, we had to pull up several hundred feet of sidewalk, clean out all the grass, lay down a sand base, replace the stones exactly as they had been. That was quite a puzzle, because there were a couple of times we said, where did this stone go? But we made it all fit. After 2 weeks or 3 weeks on this, we finally got to the end, and she came out, and she looked, and she said, it looks like you did a good job. She says, you guys stand down. We waited. About 5 minutes later, she came out with 3 big, cold orange drinks. So she said, let's toast to your effort, which we did. And then we also each took our glasses and spilled some of our orange drink on the sidewalk to initiate the new sidewalk. She continued to do work into the 60s. Again, she was well known around town. She was still doing a little bit of speaking. And there's one other item here I'd like you to know about. This is the summer of 1967. That summer, Aunt Hattie bought a car with some shopping assistance from me. She'd not been driving for 2 years because of an accident. She had developed tunnel vision, and that did not work in her favor. Since first being in a car accident in 1965, when she had gone up to the Burrell residence, all of you know where the Burrell residence is on West River Road. The Burrells and the Roots knew each other. She had purchased a 1963 Fairlane. I thought a smaller car might be better for her. She often was then another 2 years older and not driven since her accident. Her vision was not what it had been earlier. There was some thought she might turn it over to me for the last year of college. And essentially what happened was she called me one morning and said, "I'm ready to go shopping. Will you go with me?" I said, "Yes, I will." We went out for 2 hours, and after 2 hours we got back. No accidents. She never made it above 30 miles an hour. But what happened to her was this. She surrendered her right to drive, not to her executor, who was my dad. She surrendered her right to drive to me, a mere 22-year-old young punk. And what she did was, I'm keeping my license. I'm not surrendering my license, but I'm going to surrender my car to you. And that's what she did. She surrendered her keys right there. I thought that was gutsy, because I remember a situation where my father took my grandfather's driving keys away, and it was almost a yelling match. I'd never seen that in him before. And that's ugly. So, one of the last times that she appears in the paper is in 1968. A young fellow named Richard Bloom, who was doing an apprenticeship for the Journal, came out. He stopped. I was working on the fence and weeding the yard for Aunt Hat. That summer I was working part-time. And this car rolls down the window. It's Rich Bloom, and he says, where did Harriet get the scuzz bag to come in and work on her fence? And pardon my French, I said, "You go to hell. I don't know why you're here." He said, "Well, I'm here to interview her for a newspaper article." So he did, and it was a grand article. And it summed Harriet's life up. One of the subtitles was, "She did her duty." And again, he summarized her very, very well. In the early 1970s, it was very noticeable by that time that Harriet was in decline, physically and particularly mentally. And for all of us, and I know I can speak for myself, when I knew such a dynamic woman, to see her losing that capacity was really, really sad. There were a couple of times she tried to cross the street, and she couldn't walk a straight line. She would do this routine. A couple of times we heard people blowing horns at her, and she nearly got killed. But there was one more incident that awaited her that was rather interesting. In 1972, she had gone to bed one night, but some of the doors were unlocked. She woke up, and her privacy shades allowed a lot of light to come in from the outside, but allowed your privacy to dress on the inside from people looking out. But she awoke, and she was on her side, and she looked, and the silhouette walks by the foot of her bed. So she was face to face with an intruder. What did she do? She rose up on one arm and said, "Excuse me, who are you, and what the hell are you doing in here?" And to listen to her to describe this thing, this guy kind of goes, and she said, "You know, I never did get an answer from him." There's 13 steps if you've ever been in the Root home, from the second floor to the first floor. Harriet thought he went down in 3. He was in a real hurry, and there was a padlocked back door that was not the entrance he came in. It was a padlocked door, the mounting was 3-inch screws. That was just completely yanked right out of the door jamb. This guy was really moving. He was in a hurry to get out of there. And he never was caught. But I felt it interesting that she was probably not afraid of anything anymore at that time, and just, "Okay, who are you? What are you doing here?" and he was not expecting to have company. So, in 1974, my father, who was her executor, took it upon himself to remove her from the house. She, by that time, had become almost childlike. She could not care for herself, and she was committed to a rest home in Avon. And she was only there for about 7 or 8 months before she expired, and I consider that to have been a blessing. One afternoon, my father and my mother went over and said, "Harriet, we're going to go for a ride." Okay. She was always glad to get out of the house. She never came back to that house again. And that whole thing is quite sad, but again, it's not the first time that's happened to people. In the early morning hours of May 28, 1975, she passed. She was in St. Joseph's Hospital. The day before, the rest home had taken her in there because she had what they called a touch of pneumonia, and they expected her to come back out. Next morning, she was gone. She passed away quietly, unexpectedly. And for me, I have to tell you, researching all this and seeing what's here, I thought I knew her. In some ways, I'm not so sure that I did. I found out more about her after her death than I did when she was alive. And the thing that so frustrates me about this is I wish I had been more mature, that I had questioned her earlier about all of this material. I don't know what you'll think after you see all of this. She was no God. She was no superhuman. But indeed, when I look at all this and what she accomplished, I am stunned. I thought I knew her, and in many respects I found out I did not know her. I did not know her until nearly 50 years after she had passed away. But I hope that when you get a chance to come up here and see some of this stuff, I'll be here to answer any questions for you. And I can only tell you this, that next to my parents, and don't get me wrong when I make this statement, she was the third most influential person in my life. And in many respects, I am today and have been a person who followed examples not only of my parents, but her. And I hope that you've gotten a little more out of this morning than who she was. The title of the presentation was Harriett Root, a woman ahead of her time. Only in that respect that she didn't get the credit, and it's still going on now with women. I don't know when it is that women are going to achieve equality. Most certainly she did her part to do that. And so I did find that I wasn't grieving, but I knew that there was a big hole in my life because she was one of those people that played a big role. I was, by the way, very fortunate to have great relatives, not only from the Hibbards and the Roots, but the Costers, which was the family my mother came from. And they all set a very fine example for me. How to be a good human being, how to treat others. And Harriet was like that too. She was actually quite a modest person. She was always pressing ahead. If you got done with a job and you wanted to award her, her reaction was, okay, that's fine. What's next? Where are we going? How are we going to get there? What are we going to do? Lastly, because she appears in this, there is a volume 2 to this. These are my personal memoirs. I'll leave this up here on the podium. Some of you might want to look at this. And by the way, there is a copy of this that I filed with you downstairs. It's entitled, Prior to Hibbard, 2 Names, 1 Life. I did not become a Hibbard and a Root through genetics. I got here through adoption. They gave me one of the most important things in my life, And that was a heritage, one that I can be proud of, one that I'm sharing with you today. This is something I think that all of you, as guests or as members of the Historical Society, should attempt. Every one of you is a walking history book. If you don't do a video of yourself, or if you don't write things down about yourself, the world will be a little less knowledgeable about some of its history, as small as it might be. Every one of you has a story to tell. I might put in a plug here to Miss Caitlin that if ever the Historical Society is doing short presentations, 15, 20 minutes, here I am. I'll talk about everything that I did wrong to get this, because I literally started one morning and said, oh, it's time to write my memoirs. And I sat down and started typing. That's not the way you do it. But it came out pretty well. I want to thank all of you for coming this morning. Again, as I say, I hope you got something out of this and you have a better understanding of... Oh, yes, I will. I want to thank Ms. Caitlin for the PowerPoint presentation. That was not going to be done until yesterday. I know you've worked hard. She, of course, is the archivalist and curator extraordinaire and idol to hundreds here at the Historical Society. Thank you. I appreciate it. And also, our videographer this morning, Miss Madison, thank you very much for your efforts, too. Thank you. Have a great day.
Let's do a big round of applause.
Do any of you have any questions?
So is Harriet obviously was a pioneer woman here, independent woman. So when she was traveling and all this, who was in the family house?
When she was traveling, it would have been my grandfather and my grandmother. They were in England for a while after they married, but when they came back home, they lived outside of Cleveland. In the 20s, they moved into the house. So they were there the whole time during the 20s, 30s, and particularly the 40s when she was away. That's always been occupied ever since.
So when did she come home to roost?
46.
But she lived in the house the whole time. She lived with his grandparents.
Yeah, she was based out of that house.
Okay.
Even though she was in Australia,
Right.
that was still her home address.
Thank you.
Is your house still across the street?
Let's put it this way. I live outside Medina, but when I was growing up, there was a house facing Root Road and then a house facing Lake Road, both of which were basically right across East Erie Avenue from the old house, from the Root house.
I thought you said you lived across the street.
I did.
Like that. Okay.
I did. Both of those houses occupied a corner, which was out in front of the Root house.
What was the original kind of modern day streets where the Root Farm stretched to? Did it go as far as Colorado?
That's a good question. The original grant to William Henry Root, who was my great-great-grandfather and who built that house, encompassed an area, and let's start on the northwest side, Euclid Avenue and Lake Road to the river. Okay, that was the west boundary.
Okay.
How many of you remember in Sheffield Lake there used to be the Vians or Vians?
Right.
Yeah. I should. You three know that. Okay, there was a restaurant and a motel down there, Vians.
Right.
That was the east side. The property line went to the river.
Wow.
And you know there's an island in the river?
Okay.
I believe at one time the family owned the island.
Oh, wow.
Is that Monkey
Okay.
Island?
Hmm?
Monkey Island?
Yeah, I think they called it Monkey. Now, what happened was at one point, when Henry died, Orville, his first son, my great-grandfather, owned from the center line of Root Road to Vians. And this is a whole nother subject. He had twin brothers born 9 years after him, Will and Walt. You mentioned Will and Walt to anybody when they were alive in the Root family, it was like, oh, Will and Walt, oh.
They must have done the finance.
They were the kind of the black sheep of the family. They owned everything from the middle of Root Road to Euclid. And there was a couple other pieces of property that were owned by the Roots. Jean?
Would you tell us about the property that has now been taken over by the lake?
All right, in 1976, following the breakup of Harriet's estate, Ben and Jane Norton, who were Historical Society members, became owners. They're still there after 45 years. Now, they had lost a lot of property back there to the lake, and Ben just had the project completed. If you ever go back there, you swam back there with a group of us. You'll go back there and you'll be in the same airspace, but you're in a different world. You have your memories. I don't know how much Ben and Jane paid, but there was a 400 stretch line of beach that was reinforced. I dare say they must have spent $1 to $2 million. I don't know. I told Ben one time, I don't want to know. It's none of my business.
But
So.
wasn't there orchards behind the house?
Yes, thank you.
Like,
In 1902, and I don't know where the photo is, it got lost. There was a photo taken back there in 1902, just in back of the home. And it showed an apple orchard and a peach orchard, I think it was back there. There were 3 or 4 acres back there that no longer exist. So just 120 years ago, if you were standing just in back of the Root home, there was another 400 or 500 feet before you fell over into the lake. Today, maybe 100 feet. And you also need to be aware of the fact that when they acquired that property, there was a second highway, 700 feet or so out from where East Erie Avenue, Lake Avenue, or Lake Road now runs. It would be 25 feet in the air, because that's the height of the lake bank, and out 700 feet. That's how much has fallen into the lake since that time. I have one question for somebody. Bob, I was going through things. This is Bob Lady. Bob also was a part of the gang who swam down there years ago. We were pretty well behaved. Yeah. Bob, I was going through something, and there's some material here in the society. My great-grandfather, William Henry Root, who built that house, he at one time was a justice of the peace. I came upon some material one day where he called for the arrest of somebody in Sheffield. And he sent out the marshal, the sheriff. His name was Glading. Do you have a relative who was in law enforcement back in the second half of the 1900s? Or are you aware of it?
I don't remember. I don't know.
Okay. I found it amusing that maybe that was a relative of yours.
Probably was.
Because wasn't your family from Sheffield for a number of years?
They owned a lot. It was the Glading homestead, like from Day Drive to Root Road, that whole area. And then my uncle owned, I think, the woods that belonged to your family. On the other side of the railroad tracks where we used to get
Yeah,
the
the
logs.
South 80, yeah.
Where we used to get the big logs to build the platforms.
Right, that's it. He's referring to the fact we used to build diving platforms. They looked like oil derricks. We put them out in the lake. Fran, did you have a question? I saw your hand.
Yeah.
It's okay.
School.
It's not school anymore. I'm not gonna yell at you. That's 50 years ago.
Okay, well, I thought way back when, but I don't know when, like the ridges were where the water was, and that it receded or something, like North Ridge, Middle Ridge, that. So was that long, long time ago?
It was 10,000 years ago. No, but seriously, North Ridge Road used to be the beach. And that's where the lake was after all the glaciers melted, and then it started to retreat.
Do you know when that was, Caroline? Would you know when that was, or a long time?
9,000-10,000 years ago is where the lake, that's where it was then. By the time, I think the glaciers started melting about 13,000 years ago, and they were gone by 10,000 years ago.
So David, you're talking about the beach road, which was parallel to East Erie, but it was in the lake where we know right now. It ran behind the house. So the stories I've heard is that ran all the way from Avon Lake down to the yacht club on Alabama Avenue when the yacht club used to be there. These friends, their house was built 1903, 1801 East Erie Avenue, and they bought the house, second or third owner, and they had a problem with their plumbing. They couldn't get the tub to drain. So they did some research work and they found the plumber who had built that house. He was still alive in his 90s. He was called Plum the Plumber. And I guess back in the early 1900s, the plumbing trade, they would do something to the plumbing so that nobody else could work on it. They had to call this plumber. They couldn't just call XYZ. So they located the man, he came, he had to go up on the 3rd floor, had a valve, turned it, and it drained. But he told them the story that when they built that house in 1903, there was that road back there, and the folks would drive to the yacht club, dressed up, you know, it was an affair. And then over the years, like you said, the erosion and all that. But if you go down, these people that lived there 1801, you can go back down, they said when the water level was a little lower, and you could feel it's all smooth paved down there, that part of the beach. So that was interesting.
Yeah, there are some accounts of people going to the beach behind the Root home, and it's big, wide, and sandy. And you go down there now, and the water comes right up to the limestone rock that's been put there as a barrier. I might add 2 other things here, and then I'm going to let you go unless you have more questions. 2 things have come up about the Root house, so let me put these to rest once and for all. Number 1, people have said that that house participated in the Underground Railroad. No, it never did. Okay? Now, William Henry Root's brother was Aaron Root, who was a great uncle to me, and he operated between the docks down here and the Borough Home on West River Road. And he was one of the final links for the slaves to get to Canada. But the Root house, no. Secondly, there have been a couple of people who have said, well, my son or daughter was taught that there are secret passages in the Root home. No, there are not, and never have been. And I can tell you this, when I was a 10-year-old, I thought, there's secret passages in this place. They're not telling me. And what I literally did on a couple of occasions was take measurements, outside measurements, go in and take room measurements, calculate the thickness of walls, and to my disappointment, no, there's no secret passages in there. I'll explain 2 things about the house that might border on that. If you enter the front door of that house and go into what was called the West Room, if you pull up the carpet in there, there is like a trapdoor. That trapdoor was put in there in about the 1920s when they put natural gas into the house. It was a way to get to the gas lines. But it was never there when the house was built. And then the second part of that equation is that there used to be 2 stairwells. One led from a clothes closet in the master bedroom to a set of steps that went down and then into the dining room, as opposed to the main foyer steps. After World War II, those were eliminated, and the steps were reversed. So what used to go up now goes down, and what used to go up became closet. I mean, it's nuts. But then they they wanted to put a bathroom upstairs and put plumbing up there, because there's only been one bathroom in the house. So those are the only things that border on secret. No secret passages, no underground railroad. And I think part of the reason was that Henry D. Root, he too was a Lorain County auditor. Now, back in the days of antebellum, when you had the slave chasers, you know, they could get you arrested and put in jail. Like, well, you're harboring property of some fellow that lives on a plantation in North Carolina. He can't do that. You got to go to jail. Because he was a public servant, he had a lot to lose. And he owned land, he had that to lose. So the Underground Railroad for my branch of the Root family just simply was never there. Any other questions? You're getting restless. Wow, hour and 25, I'm still up here. Yes?
Which Wesleyan University did Harriet?
She never went there.
That was a mistake.
That's Rutledge, Wellesley.
That was a mistake.
Yeah, she went to Wellesley.
Yeah, David,
It
it
says
was
Wesleyan on the
screen.
screen.
It said Wesleyan on the screen.
Oh.
It's actually Wellesley.
Oh, okay.
That was an error.
You're forgiven.
I just thought, what's your accent, because you're from the east side.
I'm added too when she was at Wellesley. That's one of the ports of entry for immigrants, and that was another thing that reinforced her desire to help people. There were weekends where she and some of her fellow students went down and met some of the immigrants, assuming they could talk English. Who are you? Where are you from? Where are you going? Why are you here? And she carried that with her all through her life. So, anything else? I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.